With the cockpit and the base assembled, it's time to paint this A-Wing fighter. Hey, I'm John. Thanks for joining me for this video today. Painting this Bandai A-Wing fighter is going to be super simple because it fits so well. There's no seam lines to deal with. I'll be able to paint the parts separate like this and then bring them together later on in the build. And it just makes painting everything so much easier. Chipping, weathering, all of it. Being able to do it apart like this is just awesome. And you can do this with most of the Bandai Star Wars alphabet soup fighters, but the A-Wing, I think, in this regard, is the king of them. Its color separation is so perfect. So what I need to do is I need to get all of these parts up on, what do we call these, Carl?
Some people call them alligator clamps. I call them pterodactyl clamps.
Thank you, Carl. I appreciate that. I'm gonna get these parts mounted up on these pterodactyl clips and get started and show you what I'm doing throughout the process. One of the features that you'll see on many of the Alliance Starfighters are various colored panels. You know, you've got most of it is white, but there'll be some gray panels. If you've ever looked at an X-Wing fighter, man, it's like a senior lady's quilting bee. There's a lot of different colors. For this kit, there's just some gray patches and some of the red patches. Now the red is provided as parts, just separate parts. So you don't have to worry about those. Just paint those parts and you'll be good to go. For the gray, they have some decals, which fit nicely. However, what I want to do is I want to actually paint those. And I thought I'd briefly show how I do this. I've primed the white parts in a light gray. And so what I'm going to do is just mask over the primer so that I can then paint it white. And when I pull the masking off, they'll be gray. Primer, paint, that's all I'm worried about. I just need a gray color to be on there. So I need to mask those off. Okay, take for example this piece right up here. That corresponds to that right there. All I'm going to do is get my handy dandy Tamiya masking tape. I'm going to detack it because even when you've got a model primed and you've got good paint on it, there's a good chance that masking tape, even Tamiya tape, will pull the paint off. So I just detack it several times on my hand, and I'm not doing it a certain number of times. I'm listening for the sound. Just listen to the difference the sound makes when you start pulling it off and when you stop. I'm going to take that piece of tape and I'm going to lightly put it on there. I'm not going to really bear down on it. I'm going to fold it around. So now I've got it masking that area. Now I take an toothpick and I just kind of define where those lines are, where that part, that section is. There it is. So that I can see it easily. All right, I've got a new number 11 blade in my knife, and I'm going to go in where I've traced it off with the toothpick. I'm just going to lightly draw it through there. Now I'm not putting any pressure. I'm just letting the weight of the knife do the work, and I'll just make several passes through there until it cuts through the tape. Now that I have it cut, I'm going to slowly and carefully peel it back against itself like that. Then flip her over. Continue that. You see how easily the tape's coming up? That's from the detacking, but it will hold plenty well to seal out the paint. But now I've got that masked off and I can paint everything else around it white. I've still got to do this little part down here, but I'll mask off all the other parts just like that, and works really well. The white parts are painted, so let me get these masks off. I went ahead and masked off one area on the underside, even though it wasn't shown on the instructions. All right, I'm pretty happy with that. I like those nice sharp lines that the masking provides. In any areas that the paint came up or that the masking was missed or anything like that, there's just a little edge right there. I'll just make that into chipping later on. Now it's time to go do the red parts. There's an old saying that even a blind squirrel finds an acorn now and again. Here's the unpainted plastic, just a piece of sprue with some parts that I haven't used. And here's my painted plastic. I got that matched pretty doggone close. What I did was took a little spare bottle that I've got, put in some Tamiya flat red, and then I just kept adding drops of XF9 whole red until I got a match that was pretty close. What I did was I just kept putting little dabs of it on the inside of the plastic, and when it got to where I thought, okay, that's close enough for government work, that's what I used. So I'm pretty happy with that. Not a bad match at all. Now there are a few little details here that I need to repaint black. The parts were originally black, so I'm going to use some Vallejo German gray to paint these hoses and this entire piston looking piece with the Vallejo German gray on both sides, and maybe a few of these other little details in here. I'm also going to apply some black paint to these parts here. There's also some of these little pipes on the other side of the model. Now, aside from the colored decals that are gray around the model, there are also a few little stencils that go around the model. There's actually quite a few that go around the model, so I need to get those on. Now, because these stencils are so small, I'm not even going to gloss coat the model. I've gotten where I only do that if it's a really large model. But for small stuff like this, I'll just go ahead and put it directly on the surface, get it positioned right. Get rid of the excess water. And then apply a good coating of Solvaset decal softener. The Solvaset will run under the edge of the decals and seal it down to the surface. Now I'll just leave that be and go around the model and do the rest of the decals. If you're not comfortable with this method of just putting it down right on the paint without any kind of pre-treatment, you could either put a decal treatment solution, a pre-setting solution, and then put the decal on top of it, or you could either spot gloss coat that area or gloss coat the whole model, depending on what you're comfortable with. I've found that this works for me, and I just kind of charge into it even without the setting with anything on the surface. I just go ahead and put it right down on the matte paint and trust the Solvaset to do its work. If there is any shininess to it or anything like that, that's just where I'm going to later put chipping or streaks or stains to deal with that. But there's so few of them, I just don't feel like that this is the point to potentially gloss coat the model. On the red parts, I want some of the raised details to stand out a little more. So I'm going to use this small, fluffy makeup brush. And I've got some Evil Sun Scarlet from Citadel on here. And I'm just going to lightly dry brush that raised detail. And it's going to give it just a little bit more pop. A little bit of a highlight. It won't be too much. And if I get some on the surrounding red, I'm okay with that, because that's just going to be some tonal variation. In fact, you can use dry brushing, a light dry brushing, to just kind of work in some color like that. If you wanted to, that can simulate some post shading actually. And if you do it light enough and you get your colors matched enough, it'll blend right in, it'll lighten the tone, but it'll give you almost a perfect blend. Sometimes it gives an interesting look to do some shading aft of panel lines so that the one half of a side of a panel line looks a little bit faded. One of the ways I do that is I de-tack a piece of Tamiya tape and I stick it on right at the panel line so that it's like this, and then I do my dry brushing from the tape back. Now this is going to be a very, very subtle difference in color. I'm trying real hard not to out-subtle myself, but you pull back starting on the tape, and you see how little paint is coming off here. I'm using very, very little paint. I've worked almost all of it off before I ever get to the model. But I can do that and then carefully remove that tape, and you can see it's given just a little bit of tonal variation right there starting at that panel line, and it just helps bring out the detail. And the way I work it is if the brush strokes are going to be this way, I start at the panel line furthest back and then continue moving forward, because if I put tape over that work I just did, it may pull up some of that color. So I can put another piece of tape here and do it back that way, and then do some right at the leading edge without the tape, and I'll get kind of a nice effect going there that helps bring out the detail. And you can make this as dramatic as you want, as use whatever colors you want. You could get really sophisticated and mask off various panels and have a really varied look, but I just wanted just a little bit of shading, or I guess that would be fading in that direction, so it's a simple way to do it. Now here you can see a good example of the highlighting that I just did with the dry brushing, and while it's reasonably subtle here, once I go in and put in a wash, which is going to be darker, that difference between the dark wash, the mid-tone, and the highlight is really going to make these details pop out, and really helps define the shape so that when somebody's looking at it, they can see all of the nice detail. It's not just one monotone color. While I'm doing some dry brushing, I got out some sky gray, and I'm just going to lightly dry brush the guns to help bring out the detail on those. Once the dry brushing has dried, I'm going to use some Citadel contrast paint. This is one called Basilicanum Gray. I'm just going to go back over and, I'm just going to blob it on there. I'm not being precious about it at all. But what this will do is it will restore those flatter areas to be a little darker, but it'll allow those highlights to pop out once it dries. You can see once it dries, it leaves darker color in the recesses, allows the highlights to show through, but just tints everything, the flat surfaces and even the dry brushing, just tints it a little bit so that it's I can't talk this morning. It's not such a sharp contrast between the dry brushed and the dark color, and it just kind of blends everything together. If you do this and you don't like the outcome, simplest thing to do is just put another layer of the contrast paint over it and see if that knocks it back to how you want it. Now I want to do some panel line shading, adding in some shadows on the red parts. So I've got some dark brown enamel wash. Now keep in mind, I haven't gloss coated this. This is matte paint. So when I put this wash on, it's going to bleed quite a bit. But I'm going to use that to my advantage because I want it to contribute to the weathering. Now if you want a cleaner model, then before you do your panel lining, I would recommend you do a gloss coat. That way you won't have near as much bleed with the wash. Now you could use an oil wash here too. I just picked an enamel simply because it was the closest thing I had at hand. So enamel, oil, brand doesn't matter. This is Ammo of MIG, but any enamel or oil wash will do. But I'm going to go ahead and just put this in and let it darken down those panel lines and the details and things like that. And then once the thinner dries off, which is only going to take it a few minutes, I'm going to come back in with some odorless thinner and clean up wherever I think it needs a little bit of cleanup. Now once the thinner has dried up a bit, I'm going to take this brush that's just damp with odorless thinner. I'm just going to begin a process of cleaning it up. Now all I do here is blend it in, push it back in towards panel lines, wipe it away. You can clean it up in the direction of flight, of, I guess you'd say, airflow, whatever you want to do. You can just take it and lightly smear it around if you want. Because since I want this to be a weathered model, I'm not too worried if there's something that looks like stains and so forth. But I'll just go through and clean this up, and I'll occasionally wipe my brush off on a piece of paper towel and get some more thinner on it. But I just go through and do a cleanup like this until I get it like I want. Now generally the way I work is I'll do this part and then I'll set it aside, and then I'll do another part and I'll set it aside, and I'll go through all the parts, and then I'll start back on this one and just look and see, okay, after it dried, after that first cleanup, are there any adjustments I want to make? Enamels and oils give you the time to do that. If you were doing this with acrylics, you'd have to be much more careful in the application because you wouldn't have the opportunity, generally, to clean them up like you do with oils and enamels. Now here you can see that part after the first cleanup, and I'll just set it aside, go through the other parts, and then come back and just take a look at it and decide, do I want to make any adjustments to it? Right now I'm pretty happy with it, but you see it just helps deepen the shadows. It provides some contrast between the base color and that dry brushing that I did with the lighter red color, and so it just begins bringing out the depth in the model and helps it keep from looking so flat. On the white parts, I'm going to use a light gray oil wash. And again, this is an area that you could use enamels or oils. I've got some new oils that I like using from Wilder, something that Adam Wilder puts out. And this is a light gray oil, and it's just thinned with odorless thinner. And I'm using the same procedure as I did with the red, just putting it on right onto the flat paint. And I'll go back in later and clean up those areas and just streak them a little bit. And again, to reiterate, if you want a cleaner model, or if you're not comfortable with putting it right down on the matte paint, go ahead and give it a satin coat or a gloss coat, which will make the cleanup a little bit easier. But I'm kind of combining two things into one by doing it right on this matte paint. And those two things being panel lining and weathering. I guess I should have pointed that out. Anyway, let me get this finished. Now, just as I did with the red parts, I'm going to clean these up. Same process. I'm just going to go in and use a brush that's just lightly damped with thinner. And I'm going to begin pushing and pulling the color back towards the panel lines. In some areas I may streak it back like that. And it's just going to give a very subtle effect when you do this. It's not going to be dramatic. But it's these subtle effects on top of subtle effects that give depth of finish. People often ask me, what do you mean by depth of finish? I don't quite get that. And basically it's just layer upon layer of weathering. So a little streak here may not seem very much, but as I streak later on, basically in the next episode, when I start doing the weathering and I start putting more streaking on top of it, it's just going to build on what I've done before, and there'll be slight color variations, and it's just going to build that surface to look like it's got much more depth in terms of realism and giving the model a sense of actual weight and size than it would if you just went in with one layer and one color. So lots and lots of colors built up are going to end up with a more pleasing result, in my opinion, than one big swab of color. That's my story and I'm sticking to it. It sounds good if you're making videos. All right, I've got all the parts with their panel line washing done. And I think the next step will be to get this guy assembled. And there it is. What an absolute pleasure of a kit to build. I mean, how many times can you think of a kit that you can paint ahead of time and then build and it works? It's just a testimony to the wonderful engineering that Bandai puts into these things. And it just looks so cool, in my opinion. Not my work, the model itself, the kit itself, the design, just so cool. Now, if you're wondering why I'm leaving the canopy off, I'm going to put that on in part 3, or part 4 rather, just to finish it up. But just to give you a little insight, I find that if I have if the thumbnails look too much alike, then people tend to not click on them thinking they're looking at something they've already seen. So for the thumbnail for this part of the series, I'll leave the canopy off. And for the final part, I'll put it on. So there'll be some distinction. So just a little insight into how my brain works when I think about these things. But this is definitely a kit that I would recommend for anyone. It's just an absolute gem of a kit. Any age level, any experience level can put this together. You can put it together and not paint it, and it's great. You can put it together and paint it, and it's great. You could open up panels and detail it and do all the stuff you want. It's still great. Just really, I think this solidifies this second experience building this solidifies my personal opinion that this is the best of the alphabet soup fighters from Star Wars, just in terms of build experience and just overall fun. It's just a great build. Well, thank you so much for watching this video. I am so grateful you have done so, especially if you're still watching at this point. I'm very thankful that you've hung around till the end. There are links down below to social media and all of those things. There's, of course, a subscribe icon over here. If you're not already subscribed to this channel, I would be most grateful if you'd click that and hit the little bell icon so that you'll know when I have videos coming out. I'd be most grateful for that. There is a link down below to Patreon, and if you'd like to support the work that I do, please take a look at that. If you're already a Patreon supporter, thank you so much for your support and the work that I do in being able to continue in this and just have the materials and the kits and the equipment that are needed to make this happen. So thank you so much for your support. It is truly a blessing to me and my family, because apart from your support, I simply wouldn't be able to do it at the pace that I do it without you. So thank you very much. And with all that being said, I'll close as I always do. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.